Welcome, everyone, to Easy History Podcast. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into the life and times of Napoleon Bonaparte. He's, a figure who looms large in history. But how much do we really know about him beyond all the myths and legends?
That's a great question. I think many people have an image of Napoleon, maybe the bicorn hat or the hand tucked into the coat, but the reality is much more complex and fascinating.
Right. I mean, was he really as short as everyone says? Did he steal the Mona Lisa? What about the whole canned food thing? These are the kinds of questions we'll be unpacking today. But first, we need to understand how this guy, born on a small island, became one of the most powerful figures in Europe.
Exactly. It's a story that starts in Ajaccio, Corsica in 1769. Corsica wasn't even officially part of France until a year before Napoleon's birth, and his family actually had a history of resisting French rule.
So not exactly the typical origin story for a French emperor. What do we know about his early years?
Well, even as a young boy, Napoleon showed ambition and a talent for leadership. He received a solid military education first at Brienne and then at the prestigious École Militaire in Paris, where he specialized in artillery.
Ah, so that's where the legendary Napoleon artillery barrages come from? But how does a young artillery officer go from school to emperor? I'm guessing the French Revolution has something to do with it.
The revolution is crucial to understanding Napoleon's rise. It was a time of immense upheaval, and he, like many others, saw it as an opportunity for advancement. He initially supported the revolution and rose through the ranks quickly, but it was a tumultuous time, and even he faced setbacks.
Setbacks? Like what? It sounds like he was on a pretty clear upward trajectory.
There were periods of suspicion and even arrest. After Robespierre's fall from power, anyone associated with the Jacobins was under scrutiny. Napoleon, for a time, was actually considered a dangerous radical.
Wow, talk about a reversal of fortune. So how did he go from being a suspect to leading armies? There's got to be a turning point somewhere.
The Siege of Toulon in 1793 is really his breakout moment. French royalists had taken control of the city and allied with the British, so it was a critical battle for the revolutionary government.
Okay, so even at this early stage, we see this theme of Napoleon versus the British, which plays out throughout his career.
Exactly. And at Toulon, Napoleon, still only 24 years old, showed his strategic brilliance. He used his artillery expertise to bombard the enemy positions, leading to a decisive French victory. This win earned him recognition, promotion to brigadier general, and a reputation for being a bold and decisive leader.
This is where we start to see the Napoleonic legend taking shape. But was Toulon just a lucky break, or was it a sign of things to come?
Toulon was a sign. His next major campaign, the Italian campaign from 1796 to 1797, solidified his reputation as a military genius and a savvy political operator. He wasn't just winning battles, he was completely outmaneuvering his opponents, securing territory and establishing new political realities.
So he wasn't just a conqueror, he was a builder too, at least in his own way. Tell us more about how he reshaped the political landscape in Italy.
He founded the Cisalpine Republic, essentially a French client state in northern Italy. He negotiated with and sometimes forced the abdication of Italian rulers, and of course he extracted significant tributes from the conquered territory.
Ah, so funding his wars with Italian art and treasure. A pretty good strategy.
It certainly helped fill the coffers of France, and some of those Italian masterpieces ended up in Paris, further enhancing Napoleon's prestige and France's cultural capital. This combination of military success, political maneuvering, and even cultural acquisition is what truly set Napoleon apart.
He was a man of many talents, it seems. Now let's talk about something a little different, the Egyptian campaign. This one isn't about conquering another part of Europe. What was he after in Egypt?
Egypt is fascinating because it shows us Napoleon's ambition on a grander scale. He saw it as a way to disrupt British trade routes to India, striking a blow against their global empire.
So, geopolitics trying to weaken a rival power? Makes sense. But there's more to it than that, right? Didn't he also have a personal fascination with ancient Egypt?
You're absolutely right. Remember, this was a time of burgeoning Egyptology, a time when people were rediscovering the wonders of ancient civilizations. Napoleon brought along scholars and scientists on this expedition. They studied the pyramids, the temples, and even discovered the Rosetta Stone, which would later be crucial in deciphering hieroglyphics.
Wow, so he was kind of like an early Indiana Jones, but with a much bigger army.
But didn't things go a bit sideways in Egypt? I mean, it's not exactly French territory today.
Well, it certainly didn't go as smoothly as he might have hoped. The Battle of the Pyramids was a major victory, capturing the popular imagination and reinforcing the Napoleonic legend. But things took a turn for the worse at sea.
I'm guessing the British had something to do with that.
You guessed it. Admiral Nelson, Britain's naval hero, dealt a crushing defeat to the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile. This left Napoleon's army stranded in Egypt, cut off from reinforcements.
Ouch, that's gotta sting. What happened next? Did he just abandon his troops and sneak back to France? He did eventually return to France, leaving his army behind with promises of help, although they ultimately had to surrender to the British. However, his timing was impeccable. France was in political turmoil, and he was seen by many as a strong leader who could restore order.
Here's where things get really interesting. Napoleon's rise to power in France wasn't just about his military glory. It was about seizing the right moment. He was a master of political maneuvering, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. France was being ruled by the Directory, which was weak and unpopular. Napoleon, with his reputation as a decisive leader, saw an opportunity.
And so began the coup of 18 Brumaire, right? I've always been fascinated by this event. How did he manage to pull it off?
It was a brilliant combination of strategy and opportunism. He had the support of key figures in the government, including his brother Lucien, who was a member of the legislature. They used a mix of political pressure and military force to dissolve the Directory and establish a new government.
And just like that, from general to...
First consul. It was a new form of government, but make no mistake, Napoleon was firmly in control. He quickly consolidated his power using a combination of forced persuasion and a keen understanding of public opinion.
He was a master of propaganda, wasn't he? Shaping his own narrative, appealing directly to the people.
Exactly. He held plebiscites, essentially referendums to legitimize his rule, and the people overwhelmingly endorsed him. They craved stability after years of revolution, and Napoleon promised to provide it.
And to solidify his authority, he staged one of the most dramatic events in European history, his coronation as emperor in 1804. What was the significance of this event, particularly that whole taking the crown from the Pope and crowning himself thing?
It was a powerful statement full of symbolism. He invited Pope Pius VII to the ceremony, but at the crucial moment, Napoleon took the crown and placed it on his own head.
Wow, what a power move. It seems almost theatrical. What message was he trying to send with that gesture?
He was signaling that his authority came from the people, not from divine right or the church. He was blending the legacy of the revolution with the grandeur of the empire. It was a calculated performance, and it worked brilliantly.
So Napoleon the Emperor. But what kind of ruler was he? Was he just a military dictator, or is there more to it?
He was undoubtedly an authoritarian ruler, but he also implemented significant reforms that had a lasting impact on France. One of his most enduring legacies is the Napoleonic Code.
The Napoleonic Code. I've heard of it, but what exactly is it? Was it just about making things more efficient, or did it have deeper implications?
It was a complete overhaul of the French legal system, a massive undertaking that aimed to modernize and unify the law. It got rid of outdated feudal practices, enshrined the principle of equality before the law, and simplified many legal procedures.
That sounds like a pretty progressive move, especially coming from someone who just crowned himself emperor.
It was progressive in many ways, reflecting the ideals of the revolution, but it also had some more conservative elements reflecting Napoleon's own views and the political realities of the time. For example, it restricted women's rights and unfortunately reintroduced slavery in the French colonies.
So a mixed bag, but undeniably a major influence on legal systems, not just in France, but around the world.
Absolutely. The Napoleonic Code's influence can still be seen in legal systems across Europe and beyond. It was a major step towards codifying and standardizing law, even if it didn't always live up to its own ideals.
It seems like everything with Napoleon is complex and full of contradictions. But while he was consolidating his power at home, his ambitions were already turning outwards. It was time for more conquering, wasn't it?
Let's just say Napoleon wasn't known for his pacifism. He launched a series of wars that would come to be known as the Napoleonic Wars, a period of almost constant conflict that engulfed Europe for over a decade.
Okay, history buffs, buckle up. The Napoleonic Wars are a wild ride, and we'll dive into them next time. But for now, I want you to think about this. If you could have dinner with Napoleon, what would you ask him? What would you want to know about this complex and contradictory figure who left such an indelible mark on history?
Welcome back to our deep dive into the life and times of Napoleon Bonaparte.
Last time we left off with Napoleon at the height of his power, Emperor of France, and ready to reshape the map of Europe.
Right, and those ambitions led to the Napoleonic Wars, a period of intense conflict that lasted for over a decade and had a profound impact on the entire continent.
These wars weren't just about conquest, though, were they? I mean, there was a lot going on at the time, a clash of ideologies and new ways of thinking about power and nationhood.
Exactly. You can't separate the Napoleonic Wars from the broader context of the French Revolution, and the ideas that came out of it. France under Napoleon represented, at least in theory, these revolutionary ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity.
But as we discussed earlier, Napoleon wasn't exactly a champion of democracy. He was an emperor after all.
True, there's a definite tension between his authoritarian rule and the ideals he claimed to represent. But he did see himself as spreading the principles of the Enlightenment, challenging the old order of monarchs and empires.
And how did the rest of Europe react to this? Were they all terrified of this revolutionary emperor, or were some more open to his ideas?
It was a mixed bag. Some countries, especially those that had been under the thumb of powerful empires, were more receptive to French influence. They saw Napoleon as a liberator, a chance to break free from old structures. But others, particularly the established powers like Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, saw him as a dangerous threat to their own power and the stability of Europe.
So the stage was set for a showdown. Where do we even begin with these Napoleonic Wars? There were so many battles, alliances, and shifting power dynamics. It's a lot to keep track of.
It is a complex period, but we can break it down into key phases. The early wars from around 1803 to 1807 saw Napoleon score a series of stunning victories against Austria, Prussia, and even Russia.
What factors contributed to his early success? Was it purely military genius, or were there other forces at play?
He was undoubtedly a brilliant military strategist, a master of maneuver warfare. He used speed and surprise to outwit his opponents, often striking before they were fully prepared. But his success was also due to the fact that his armies were well-trained, well-equipped, and highly motivated. They believed in what they were fighting for, at least in the early years.
There was a real sense of national pride and revolutionary fervor fueling those early victories, wasn't there?
Absolutely. And Napoleon was a master of harnessing that energy, presenting himself as the embodiment of France's destiny and greatness. But there was one major power he couldn't seem to defeat: Great Britain.
Right. The British, they were a constant thorn in Napoleon's side. Throughout his career, they couldn't match him on land, but their navy was unbeatable.
Exactly after the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, where Admiral Nelson decisively defeated the combined French and Spanish fleets, British naval supremacy was undeniable. Napoleon's dreams of invading England were effectively sunk.
So if he couldn't conquer them directly, how did he try to undermine British power?
He tried to cripple them economically with the Continental System, essentially a massive embargo aimed at blocking all trade between continental Europe and the British Isles. He figured if he could cut off their trade, he could weaken their economy and ultimately their ability to wage war.
That sounds like a pretty ambitious plan, trying to control the trade of an entire continent. Did it work?
It didn't really have the intended effect. Smuggling continued, and neutral countries like the United States actually benefited from the trade disruptions. It also ended up hurting the economies of France and its allies, creating resentment and opposition to Napoleon's rule.
So an economic war that ultimately backfired. How did Britain respond to the continental system?
They retaliated with blockades of their own and seized neutral ships suspected of trading with France. This led to tensions with the United States, culminating in the War of 1812.
Wow. So the Napoleonic Wars were having ripple effects across the Atlantic, too.
Hmm.
But back in Europe, wasn't there also a growing resistance to French dominance?
You're absolutely right. Napoleon's conquests, while initially seen by some as liberating, eventually sparked a wave of nationalism across Europe, especially in Germany and Spain. People began to resent French rule and yearned for their own independent nations.
So Napoleon inadvertently sowed the seeds of his own downfall by spreading the very ideas that would ultimately be used against him. How fascinating.
Exactly. His attempts to impose French culture and laws often backfired, strengthening national identities in opposition to French rule.
We've talked about some of Napoleon's setbacks, but I think the invasion of Russia in 1812 stands out as a major turning point. Can you remind us why this campaign was such a disaster for him?
The Russian campaign was a colossal miscalculation on Napoleon's part. He led a massive army, over 600,000 men, into Russia, determined to force Tsar Alexander I to comply with his demands. But he underestimated the sheer scale and resilience of Russia.
So what went wrong? We've talked about Napoleon's military genius, but it seems like something went seriously awry in Russia.
Several factors contributed to the disaster. First, the Russians, under General Kutuzov, adopted a scorched earth policy. They retreated, burning everything in their path, denying Napoleon's army supplies and shelter.
So logistical nightmare on top of facing a determined enemy.
Exactly. Then, as if things weren't bad enough, The brutal Russian winter set in Napoleon's army, unprepared for such harsh conditions, was decimated by freezing temperatures, disease, and starvation. The once mighty Grande Armée was reduced to a shadow of its former self.
It's almost Shakespearean, this grand ambition brought low by hubris and the unforgiving forces of nature. The retreat from Russia must have been a devastating blow to Napoleon's morale and his reputation.
It was a turning point in the Napoleonic Wars. His enemies, sensing weakness, formed a new coalition. Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, and launched a counteroffensive.
And this led to
Napoleon's first abdication in 1814, he was exiled to the island of Elba, and the Bourbon monarchy was restored in France, but as we know, that wasn't the end of the story.
Right. There's still the dramatic escape from Elba, the 100 Days, and the final showdown at Waterloo. It seems like even in defeat, Napoleon couldn't resist one last gamble.
It's true, he had a remarkable ability to bounce back to inspire loyalty even after his empire had crumbled. But we'll delve into those final chapters and the legacy of this complex and fascinating figure next time.
Okay, listeners, we've covered a lot of ground today, from Napoleon's early victories to his disastrous Russian campaign. As we move into the final part of our deep dive, think about this. How did Napoleon's actions and the events of his era shape the Europe we know today? Welcome back to our deep dive into the Napoleonic era.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? From those humble beginnings in Corsica to, the heights of imperial power and then ultimately to defeat and exile.
We've covered Napoleon's incredible rise, his military genius, and those devastating wars that engulfed Europe. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's time to grapple with something even more complex: his legacy. How should we remember Napoleon Bonaparte?
That's the question, isn't it? That historians and I think, frankly, everyday people have been wrestling with for centuries. He was a man of contradictions, capable of great brilliance and terrible cruelty.
Yeah, he was both a liberator and an oppressor, a product of the Enlightenment, who also reintroduced slavery in the French colonies. It's hard to reconcile those things.
It really is. Napoleon, I think, in a way, embodied the spirit of his age, the age of revolution and upheaval, but he also reflected its darker aspects. He was a master of using, revolutionary ideals to justify his own authoritarian rule.
He was a military genius, no doubt about it, but he was also responsible for the deaths of millions. It's a sobering thought.
It is. It's important to acknowledge the full scope of his impact, both the positive and the negative. He left a trail of destruction across Europe, but he also left behind a legacy of reforms, legal codes, and even cultural shifts that continue to shape our world today.
Even in defeat, there's a certain romanticism to his story, isn't there? The image of the exiled emperor on St. Helena brooding over his lost glory has captured the imagination of artists and writers for centuries.
Wow. Absolutely. Napoleon's life has all the elements of a classic tragedy: ambition, triumph, hubris, and ultimately downfall. He's become a larger-than-life figure, a symbol of the allure and dangers of unchecked ambition.
And speaking of legacy, we can't forget about the very concrete ways Napoleon's actions continue to affect us. The Napoleonic Code, for example, is still the basis for legal systems in many countries around the world.
Yeah, it's amazing to think that a legal code created over 200 years ago still has such a profound influence today. It's a testament to Napoleon's vision and his understanding of the power of law to shape society.
And as we discussed earlier, his military campaigns, for all their destruction, also spurred innovations in warfare technology and even food preservation.
Necessity is the mother of invention, as they say. Napoleon's quest for military dominance had unintended consequences, leading to advancements that would ultimately benefit society as a whole.
So Napoleon's legacy is this complex tapestry of light and shadow, progress and destruction, brilliance and tyranny. How do you even begin to sum up such a figure?
It's a challenge. He wasn't a hero or a villain. He was both and neither. He was a man of his time, driven by ambition, shaped by circumstance, and ultimately responsible for both great good and great harm.
His story reminds us that history is never simple, that even the most influential figures are full of contradictions, and it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of power and the unintended consequences of even the most well-intentioned actions.
It's a story that continues to fascinate us precisely because it raises so many questions about human nature, leadership, and the forces that shape our world.
Now, before we wrap up, let's have some fun and address some of the myths and legends that have sprung up around Napoleon. I think it's safe to say that every historical figure of his stature attracts a certain amount of embellishment.
It seems people can't resist a good story, even if it stretches the truth a bit.
We've already debunked the myth about his height and the one about him stealing the Mona Lisa, but there are plenty of others out there.
Oh, yeah. Like the story that he escaped from St. Helena and lived out his days in secret somewhere. The Lost Emperor myth, always a popular one.
It's a romantic notion, but unfortunately there's no evidence to support it.
Yeah.
History is full of enough drama without having to invent more.
And then there's the rumor that he poisoned his own troops in Egypt. A pretty dark accusation, but again, no historical basis for it.
It seems like people can't resist a good conspiracy theory, especially when it involves a figure as enigmatic as Napoleon.
But as fascinating as those stories might be, it's important to separate fact from fiction to ground our understanding of history in evidence, not speculation.
Yeah.
And that's what we've tried to do in this deep dive to present a nuanced and balanced portrait of Napoleon Bonaparte, warts and all.
Well said. He was a flawed and complex figure, but undeniably one of the most influential individuals in human history. His story continues to be debated and reinterpreted today, and I suspect it will continue to fascinate people for centuries to come.
I agree. Napoleon's life and legacy are a reminder that history is not a static subject. It's a living, breathing dialogue between the past and the present. And as new evidence emerges and perspectives evolve, our understanding of this remarkable figure will continue to change and deepen.
So there you have it, folks. Our deep dive into the Napoleonic era has come to an end. But we hope this has sparked your curiosity about Napoleon and his times, and perhaps inspired you to explore this fascinating period of history further.
As always, thanks for joining us on the deep dive.